And just like that, we are in week 10 of the fantasy season, so you know exactly what we need to do. We're going to go through every single matchup, talk about every single running back, and go over who you should be starting and who you should be sitting here in week 10. All right, very quickly here, 4 teams on bye week here in week 10 of the season. The Tennessee Titans, the Cincinnati Bengals, the Kansas City Chiefs, and the Dallas Cowboys. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and making adjustments accordingly. All right, let's kick the video off with Thursday Night Football. We're going to have the Raiders traveling to face the Broncos. Let's start with the Raiders side of things. Not exactly a great matchup here for Ashton Jeanty, as the Broncos are coming in top 5 against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed here in the 2025 season. But Jeanty coming off of a really solid game, just 13 touches, but 5 targets, 5 catches, had 47 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown, just 42 rushing yards on the ground, but definitely made the most of that involvement in the receiving game. He now only has, 2 games on the season with at least 5 receptions. Every other game on the season, 3 or less receptions. And like I said, it's not a great matchup here. The Raiders are on the road. The Raiders are okay on offense this past week. Geno Smith actually looked like a capable quarterback. These Thursday Night Football matchups this year have been pretty high scoring, so I don't love this spot here, but 19.9 fantasy points this past week. Double digits in every game this year except for 3. I do kind of worry about the overall game script here for the Raiders and like how much they're actually going to need to run the football, but I still think Jeanty belongs in the start category. So we'll leave him there and see what happens here in the early portion of the week, Then we move to the Broncos running backs. Down week for Dobbins this past week. I'm going to say good Houston Texans run defense. I mean, this was a tough matchup. We knew it. It's a top 12 unit that they were going up against this past week in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, but I don't want to overreact here. He still had 15 total touches, 1 target, 1 catch added to that, and still saw the majority of the overall volume at the running back position for the Broncos. So this is a much better matchup against the Raiders this week. The Raiders have been decent enough, but they're still bottom 12 against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed to the position. I mean, they were a little bit higher ranked earlier in the season, but they've scooted back here. So I think Dobbins, a solid start. He still has had a very good fantasy season. Has only given you single-digit performances 3 times on the year, so pretty safe floor, belongs in the start category. Then I think RJ Harvey is worth a flex. I don't want to overreact too much here. Like, I know he's had double-digit fantasy points in 2 straight weeks, but in week 8, it was against one of the very worst run defenses in the NFL, in the Dallas Cowboys. He's somehow managed 3 touchdowns in that game. Then this past week, he just had 2 total carries, but 5 targets, 5 catches, 51 receiving yards, and a touchdown. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from Harvey. He's scored in 3 straight games. He has scored in 4 games since week 4 of the season, but it still doesn't really feel like, it's not even close to being like a 50-50 split here. So Harvey, perfectly fine flex, but the volume has still been low. So if he doesn't score, you're probably not going to feel great, but certainly not taking anything away from RJ Harvey here. I think he's worth a flex, and we'll just leave it at that moving into week 10. I think this is a great bounce back spot for J.K. Dobbins here in week 10 of the season. So I'm going to head straight to Underdog and take the over on him to score a rushing touchdown. Like I said, he still has been plenty productive on the season, and through the first 5 weeks of the season, he had a rushing touchdown in 4 out of those 5 matchups. So he is due for either a rushing or receiving touchdown. Don't forget, all new users who sign up on Underdog using promo code THECATCH are getting a free NFL Pick'em to use towards NFL Week 10 action. Take that free Pick'em. Take Dobbins to score a touchdown. If both of those lines hit, you're going to automatically double your cash entry. And on top of that, Underdog is also going to give you $50 in bonus cash once you play through $5 on Underdog, as long as you sign up using promo code THECATCH. So make sure you guys sign up using promo code THECATCH. That link is down below on Underdog if you want to take advantage of all of their Week 10 exclusive NFL offers. All right, we're going to get an early morning game here in Week 10. The Falcons will be facing the Colts overseas. This should be probably as straightforward of a matchup as you're going to see in Week 10. Let's start with the Falcons side of things. We have Bijan Robinson coming off of a solid performance against the New England Patriots, 17.6 fantasy points, 46 yards on the ground, and that was it. But he had 10 targets, 8 catches for 50 receiving yards. And that was, in Week 8, after an abysmal performance in Week 8 against the Miami Dolphins, which seemed to perplex just about everybody. Tyler Algier did next to nothing this past week, just 2 touches for 6 rushing yards. So we're going to keep Bijan Robinson in the start category, really regardless of matchup. It's not the greatest matchup here against the Colts. They've been pretty good against opposing running backs here on the season, but it's Bijan Robinson. If you own him, you are rolling with them. And the same goes for Jonathan Taylor. No matter what happened the previous week, no matter what the matchup is, JT is staying in your starting lineup. He had his first single-digit fantasy performance on the season this past week, but he is still a top 2 running back in all scoring formats. Let's not overreact here. It was not the Colts' week. They needed to throw the football for the first time like all season long. This game script did not benefit Jonathan Taylor. And listen, the Falcons have actually moved back pretty substantially in overall rankings. They are a bottom 10 unit against opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed. So this is a good spot for JT. Don't overthink it. Don't even think about last week. Jonathan Taylor is still a must-start running back here in Week 10 of the season. Moving into Sunday's early window, we're going to get the Browns traveling to face the Jets. Let's start with the Browns side of things. Don't know at this point in the week if Quinshon Judkins is going to play or not. It looks like early reporting is indicating that he will have the possibility to play in Week 10. Decent enough matchup here against the Jets. They are a bottom 12 unit against opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed on the season. So if Judkins plays, I think he's a perfectly fine start. If he doesn't play, then we have the potential to flex Dylan Sampson or Jerome Ford. I feel as if Dylan Sampson has more upside because of the potential receiving work. Don't forget, in the first 2 weeks of the season, when we saw no Quinshon Judkins in Week 1, then a limited Quinshon Judkins in Week 2 for the most part. He still had 13 touches in that game. We still saw double-digit performances out of Sampson in both of those matchups. So I would rather gamble on Dylan Sampson, but I guess Jerome Ford could be in the mix if you guys are really, really desperate. Good enough matchup here, and as always, the Browns are going to rely on the run game with Dylan Gabriel at quarterback. Even if he throws a lot, they're still going to need help from the running back position. So going to prefer Judkins, of course, but the opportunity will be there for other running backs if he's not able to go. Now, moving on to Breece Hall, coming off of his best fantasy performance of the season, 32.8 fantasy points, had 133 yards on the ground, 2 rushing touchdowns, added 2 catches for 14 receiving yards back in Week 8 as the Jets were on bye week in Week 9. So when we look at Breece Hall, I was going to leave him in the start category, but this is a tough matchup. The Browns have given up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs on the year, so I'm going to leave him as startable. Plus, we're probably expecting Isaiah Davis to get some sort of volume in this matchup as he had 7 touches on the ground in Week 8 and 5 targets for 5 catches in Week 8 and had himself a decent fantasy day as well. So I think Breece Hall is perfectly fine to start. Don't get me wrong, but he could lack some of that potential upside. We look to Week 6 and 7 against the Broncos and the Panthers, at least decent or good run defenses, 7.2 or less fantasy points. And you could even go back a little bit further, like Week 3 against Tampa Bay, 9.2 fantasy points. Did struggle in Week 2 against a poor run defense in the Bills, but the Jets had an awful Week 2. A lot of the better fantasy performances, the double-digit performances for Breece Hall this year have been against soft run defenses like the Steelers, the Dolphins, the Cowboys, and the Bengals. So I just don't know if he has a tremendous amount of upside this week. Perfectly fine to start if you don't have better options, but like I said, the upside is definitely capped. And I know we've talked a lot about Isaiah Davis lately on the channel. I'm not ready to call him a start, especially against this Browns run defense, but definitely a player worth rostering, a good handcuff, and a player to own if Breece Hall somehow gets traded this week. I don't think it's going to happen, but still a player who could have standalone value against soft defenses, but here in Week 10, just going to have him as a sit. All right, next up we have a divisional matchup between the Saints traveling to face the Panthers, and boy, oh boy, what are we going to do with Alvin Kamara? 0.7 fantasy points this past week, 6 touches, 14 rushing yards, 3 targets, 1 catch. That was it. It was not good with Tyler Shuck at quarterback, and it hasn't been good whether it's been Spencer Rattler or Tyler Shuck. Let's be honest. For Alvin Kamara on the season, we're looking at 3 straight games with 6.5 or less fantasy points, and overall, I mean, like the running back position is just not getting a lot of involvement. Devin Neal, 4 total touches on the ground and through the air this past weekend. The Saints are kind of just constantly in position where they need to throw the football. And I think that this Panthers defense overall is a bit underrated right now. I mean, they still are 17th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. Like, they're not great against the running back position, but they're not awful. And overall, the defense has been playing okay at times, unless they're like facing the Bills. But nonetheless, I don't like this spot on the road here for the Saints going up against the Panthers at home. So I don't have any interest in Alvin Kamara or any Saints running back here in week 10. And I don't want to say you should drop Alvin Kamara, but maybe we're getting close to that point. We'll find out. Probably still worth rostering, but we're at that point in the season. If a player is just a roster clogger, you're never starting them, they're just sitting on your bench, what real value are they bringing to your fantasy roster? At that point in the season, you got to start asking yourself that question. All right, Rico Dowdle was the clear-cut RB1 for the Panthers this past week after we got quite a bit of coach speak from Dave Canales this past week that some took, with a grain of salt and some people really ran with. And if you ran with it, Rico Dowdle was the clear-cut RB1 this past week, 25 rushing attempts, 130 rushing yards, 3 targets, 2 catches. We compare that to Chuba Hubbard, who had 5 touches on the ground, just 17 rushing yards. So 5.2 yards per carry for Rico Dowdle. Then Chuba Hubbard just 3.4 yards per carry. And most importantly, arguably here, Rico Dowdle also scored 2 rushing touchdowns. And that was against the Green Bay Packers, which was supposed to be a tough matchup. They're still a top 10 unit against opposing running backs on the season. And it was no problem for Rico Dowdle at the end of the day. And even though he didn't get a ton of involvement in week 8 against Buffalo, and that was a game script that didn't work in his favor, still had 6.7 yards per carry off of just 8 touches in week 8. So Dowdle has been really solid since week 5 of the season. You got to keep rolling with him if you own him. And you got to feel pretty good about this matchup against the Saints, 18th overall against opposing running backs. It's not the best matchup, but it's certainly not the worst. And overall, you just got to feel good right now if you own Rico Dowdle. We're going to put Chuba Hubbard as a sit and just leave it at that. I do think there is still some potential that Chuba could get involvement. He vultured a touchdown in week 8, for example. I could see that type of thing still happening, but feels as if the Panthers are rolling with Rico Dowdle until further notice. We'll find out. But here in week 10, Rico Dowdle got to be a must-start running back. Next up, we have the Patriots traveling to face the Buccaneers, and this should be a good overall matchup. And let's start with the Patriots side of things. Ramondre Stevenson missed week 9 against the Falcons, and dealing with a toe issue. Don't know if he's going to be able to play in week 10 or not. I think if he plays, if he's good to go, he's worth a flex. This was a really confusing week this past week for the Patriots backfield. And I'll just start by saying, a lot of people look at this Tampa Bay Buccaneers defense and they get worried, this isn't a good matchup. And, this Buccaneers defense is really good in terms of limiting total rushing yards, but they're kind of middle of the pack against allowing rushing touchdowns, and they're really bad in terms of receiving running backs. They allow a lot of receptions and receiving yards. Ultimately, they're 26 overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs, so they're a bottom 10 unit against opposing running backs, even though they're able to really limit total rushing yards. They've only given up 570 total rushing yards. I mean, that is one of the best marks in the NFL, top 10, but they rank really poorly in terms of fantasy points allowed. So it's just one of those weird conundrums. Nonetheless, this past week, we saw no Ramondre Stevenson, Travion Henderson. This was your moment, except the Patriots hate you. He had a solid day, 12.7 fantasy points, 55 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 4 catches for 32 receiving yards. We saw 11 touches to Terrell Jennings, 35 yards on the ground for him, a touchdown and 1 catch for 9 receiving yards. So don't exactly know what this split is going to look like overall here in week 10 of the season, but this should be a competitive matchup with points scored. 2 of the better teams in the NFL right now, despite the Buccaneers' injuries and all those issues. But yeah, this is going to be a good matchup. I expect points scored in this game, so Stevenson or Henderson could be flex. But as always, they limit each other's upside, and who knows what the Patriots are going to do on a week-to-week basis in terms of running back volume. Then we look to the Buccaneers side of things, okay? Don't know if Bucky Irving's going to play this week or not. He has a foot issue and a shoulder issue, and I will just go ahead and say it feels like the injury issues around Bucky Irving have been really kind of murky for the past couple of weeks. And I'm starting to really worry about like his status here in the 2025 season. But there's a chance he plays this week. If he starts, I think he's good to go. It is a tough matchup. The Patriots have been top 5 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running back. So can't really love that. But Bucky Irving, I mean, he's a player who can pop against any defense, so I think you can go ahead and roll with him if he starts. If it's Rachaad White, I also think he's very startable, although the past 2 weeks, 8.4 or less fantasy points, so it hasn't been great for Rachaad White as of late. The game scripts haven't exactly benefited him. Like, Week 8 should have, but the Bucs defense was just doing so much that they didn't even need to run the football, nor did they need to throw the football. Week 7 was just not the Bucs week whatsoever against the Lions. So I think White could bounce back here at home, coming off of the bye week, extra time to rest and prepare for this matchup. Just depends on who the starting running back is going to be for the Bucs this week. And I still think if Bucky plays, Rachaad White has some standalone value, but his upside will definitely be capped if Bucky is out there. So we'll see how this shakes out. Two kind of murky situations for these teams when it comes to the running back situation, but we'll see what happens here in week 10. Moving along, we have the Ravens traveling to face the Vikings. Let's start with the Ravens side of things. I'm going to keep Derrick Henry in the start category. Some people like looking at that week 9 performance and not feeling great on Thursday Night Football. Like, I guess because Derrick Henry didn't score a touchdown, but he had 6.2 yards per carry, 119 yards on the ground, 13.1 fantasy points. So he's given you double-digit fantasy performances in 3 straight games, and inevitably he's going to start scoring touchdowns at some point again. I mean, Lamar Jackson threw 4 touchdowns this past week. And I still think with Lamar Jackson on the field, that is good for Derrick Henry at the end of the day. So gets a Vikings defense that gives up a lot of rushing yards, but ultimately is still top 12 against the running back position on the season in terms of fantasy points allowed. They've only given up 5 rushing touchdowns. Ravens are on the road here, but honestly, I don't really care about any of it. If you own Derrick Henry, just keep rolling with him. He's going to be as safe as a running back as you can start here in week 10 of the season. Then we look to the Vikings side of things. Okay, this is a good matchup at the end of the day. The Ravens have improved slightly. They're getting a bit healthier, but they're still a really, really bad team. Bottom 5 unit in terms of running back or fantasy points allowed to running backs on the season. So this is still a good spot. Aaron Jones dealing with that shoulder issue, was having a pretty solid game against the Lions before he had to exit, but most of the early reporting is indicating that Aaron Jones is probably going to be good to go, be able to play this week. So I think he's flexible due to the matchup, being at home, and due to the fact that he was playing solid, but the injury makes you a little bit worried. And then I left Jordan Mason in the flex area, but really to me, he's only a flex if Aaron Jones doesn't play. And like, this is just one of those like, you know, split backfields that isn't great for fantasy. But like I said, it's a really good matchup. The Vikings are at home. JJ McCarthy looked pretty good this past week. So like, still reason to believe in this offense. They still have great pass catchers with Jordan Addison, Justin Jefferson, and TJ Hawkinson. So against this Ravens defense, there is belief, you know, that they can move the football. But at the same time, the Ravens defense has looked okay as of late, so it's tough to say. But Aaron Jones, if he plays, I think a solid flex. If he's out, Jordan Mason, lower ceiling, but still a pretty good flex here due to the matchup. So we'll see how it shakes out here in week 10. Moving along, we have the Bills traveling to face the Dolphins. This is going to be another pretty straightforward matchup. James Cook going to be an absolute must-start running back against this Miami Dolphins defense, which has technically improved slightly in the past few weeks, but at the same time, they've been awful against the running back position on the season and bottom 10 unit. So got to roll with James Cook. I know he didn't score this past week, but he still had 114 yards on the ground, 13.5 fantasy points. You know, he's not going to score 2 or more touchdowns or rush for over 200 yards every single week. Still a really solid week. It's a great matchup. James Cook's an absolute must-start running back this week. Ray Davis just going to be a handcuff, nothing more. Devon Achane, an absolute must-start running back here in week 10 of the season, as the Bills have also been very soft against opposing running backs, bottom 10 against the running back position in terms of fantasy points allowed. Devon Achane, double digits every single game this year. Didn't score this past week, but had 67 yards on the ground, 6 catches for 39 receiving yards. You still got to feel good if you own Devon Achane. He got 2 top 5 running backs in terms of fantasy points scored in full and half PPR on the season in A-Chain and Cook in this game. So we're rolling with both these guys. In terms of whoever the next running back up for the Dolphins would be, as Ollie Gordon is dealing with that ankle sprain. He may not play in this week, but whoever it is, Jalen Wright still banged up. They're just going to be a handcuff, nothing more. James Cook, Devon A-Chain, absolute must-start running backs as we get into Week 10. Next up, we have the Giants traveling to face the Bears. Let's start with the Giants side of things. A really disappointing week for anyone who picked up Tyrone Tracy, probably the top waiver addition moving into Week 9. He had 5 touches, 18 rushing yards, 4 targets, 3 catches, 19 receiving yards, a whopping 6.7 fantasy points. Can't feel great there. And the Niners have been banged up defensively. They rank kind of middle of the pack in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs. And yeah, it just wasn't a good day for the Giants running backs. And then we saw Devin Singletary get involved as well. He actually outsnapped Tyrone Tracy. 56% of snaps went to Devin Singletary. The other 44% went to Tyrone Tracy. Tracy had 8 total touches. Then Devin Singletary had 10 total touches. So pretty close to a 50-50 split here. And I think both these guys are just really risky flexes. Can't call more than that. The Bears have improved against running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed, and they've gotten worse in terms of fantasy points allowed to wide receivers and tight ends as well. But it's still a good enough matchup here. But yeah, the Giants are kind of in this spot where Jackson Dart's overcompensating. He's going to run the football a lot, and he's doing it with success. So maybe overcompensating is not a great word. But in other words, they're in position where they need to throw the football a lot. So guys like Rondell Robinson, Darius Slayton, Theo Johnson are benefiting. And the running back committee here just didn't really benefit this past week. And I don't know if they're going to benefit in this game script against the Bears as well. So can't call them anything more than risky flexes. And you're really just crossing your fingers that one of them scores. And that's all we can really hope for with these Giants running backs now that Cam Scatterbo is out for the year. All right, DeAndre Swift missed Week 9 dealing with that groin injury. Unclear if he's going to play here in Week 10 or not, and that opened things up for rookie running back Kyle Monangai to have a monster fantasy day against the worst run defense in the NFL in Cincinnati Bengals this past week. He didn't score somehow, but he had 176 rushing yards, 3 catches for 22 receiving yards, 22.8 fantasy points. That really high scoring affair against the Bengals this past week. So now we move to Week 10. The Giants are a bottom 5 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. I mean, they are close to as bad as the Bengals. They've given up over 1,000 rushing yards, 8 rushing touchdowns, over 300 receiving yards, and 3 receiving touchdowns on the year. So DeAndre Swift's going to be a must-start running back if he plays, and I think either way, Kyle Monangai can be viewed as a start in this game as well. I think we could start to see some matchups similar to Week 7 against the Saints where both these running backs have fantasy value, even if they are both active. And I would say this matchup at home against the Giants could certainly be one of those matchups. But obviously, if Swift misses Week 10 as well, Kyle Monangai is going to be a must-start running back as he will see all of the volume. But really, since the Bears came out of the bye week, they have been running the football a ton. I mean, even this past week in a matchup where they needed to throw, they have continued to run the football at a high rate. So once again, this is going to be an interesting backfield as the weeks start to progress here towards the end of the fantasy season. But I think that both these guys will have standalone value, especially in soft matchups. And they're getting a very soft matchup here in Week 10 of the season. Next up, we have the Jaguars traveling to face the Texans. It's going to be an interesting one. Let's start with the Jaguars side of things. This will be the final game in the early window. Travis Etienne, solid Week 9, 16.5 fantasy points, 84 yards on the ground, 5 catches off of 5 targets for 31 receiving yards. Then we saw Bashal Tutin get some involvement. He scampered into the end zone towards the end of the game, 9 touches, 29 rushing yards, had a catch for -3 receiving yards. So not a ton of involvement, but a little bit. Then, got that red zone carry that led to a touchdown. But I still kind of feel as if this is Etienne's clear backfield. I mean, 27 total touches in this game. But kind of the issue here is that this Texans defense overall, they're just good, and they don't give up a ton of touchdowns. They have given up 7 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown to running backs on the year, but they're still top 12 against opposing running backs. And like overall, they're just very, very good against opposing offenses. And they're going to have to be with CJ Stroud potentially missing this week. But I'm going to leave ETN as a start, maybe a little bit in the lower end start category, but I think he'll still be solid this week, even if the upside is capped due to the matchup. I don't really see this being a super high scoring game, but I think that ETN is certainly startable. I'll leave Tootin in the sit category. I think the touchdown is kind of lucky. Don't want you guys to just be hoping that he scores a touchdown. And even with the touchdown, he didn't have double-digit fantasy points. So let's leave him in the sit category. Okay. Woody Marks, 2.7 fantasy points this past week against the Broncos. Nick Chubb, 3.4 fantasy points. 11 touches for Chubb, 10 touches for Marks. 48% of snaps to Marks, 36% of snaps to Chubb. So this is just not a good situation for fantasy. And once again, you're really just hoping that one of these guys scores, or Woody Marks gets enough involvement in the passing game that he gets enough receptions that you get like 12-ish fantasy points. So I'm just staying away here, especially with CJ Stroud, in concussion protocol. If he doesn't play this week, this is going to be one of those weeks where I think that the Jaguars can be very opportunistic and have a good defensive day against a backup quarterback like Davis Mills. And the Jags have been top 10 against opposing running backs on the year in terms of fantasy points allowed. So not loving this matchup. I'm staying away from the Texans running backs here in week 10. All right, let's move into the afternoon slate, starting with the Cardinals traveling to face the Seahawks. Now, as always, I do have to record these videos before Monday Night Football has been played, so I'm kind of in a tough spot here because this Cardinals backfield is as confusing as ever. We might get Trey Benson back in week 10, which I think would clear things up. I think the clear-cut RB1 would just be Trey Benson, but it's not a very good matchup overall. Seahawks 13th overall in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, and that defense is for real overall. So it's going to be a tough spot for the Cardinals on the road. But on top of all that, I just have no idea what this split's going to look like. We're really going to have to pay attention to the Cardinals and Cowboys game for week 9. And, we might get some Bam Knight. We might get some Michael Carter. Could get Amari DeMarcado mixed in there as well. And they're facing a very soft run defense in the Cowboys. But really, regardless of what happens, I think it's just a big question mark, and you can't really even trust it because if Trey Benson is active in week 10, like I said, I think he's going to get the bulk of the carries, and then it's just not as good of a matchup. We're comparing apples to oranges, as the Cowboys have given up the second most fantasy points only to the Bengals to running backs before Monday Night Football has been played here on the season. So just going to have to wait this one out. I know some people are rostering Bam Knight and Michael Carter and waiting for Trey Benson to get off IR, but gonna have to wait this one out. You guys can drop me comments down below as the week progresses if you guys are dealing with any of the Cardinals running backs. Then we look to the Seahawks. I mean, listen, this team is throwing the football with a lot of efficiency, and they're still running the football pretty well on top of that, but they're just not producing from a fantasy perspective. I mean, this is a split committee between Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet, so I hate to be lazy, but I give you guys the same answer every single week. You can flex Kenneth Walker, you can flex Zach Charbonnet, but you are crossing your fingers for a touchdown or like enough receiving work that they are relevant and get you guys double-digit fantasy points. It can always happen, but you also look at a game like this past week against the Commanders. It just didn't happen, right? So I will say it's a good matchup. The Cardinals have been pretty soft against the run, so there's that, but I truthfully can't call Kenneth Walker or Zach Charbonnet anything more than a flex moving into week 10. All right, next up we have the Lions on the road, coming off of a loss, traveling to face the Commanders, whose season is probably completely over, which I'm allowed to say as a Commanders fan, but let's start with the Lions side of things. It was a tough week this past week against the Vikings. Kind of got put in a game script where they needed to throw. David Montgomery had a pretty costly fumble, so Monty did score a touchdown, kind of salvaged his day, had 11 fantasy points. Gibbs, it was just not his day, and this is going to happen even with, absolute stud running backs. 9 touches, 25 rushing yards, 3 catches off of 3 targets for 3 receiving yards, and that was it, 5.8 fantasy points for him. So I think these guys are going to bounce back. The Commanders are beat up across the board at just about every position, it feels like. This is going to be one of those games where the Lions are going to come out swinging, coming off of a tough loss to a divisional opponent. So I think you got to roll with Jahmyr Gibbs. And this is also one of those, game scripts that could benefit David Montgomery. Could see more, running the football later in the game, as I'm going to assume the Lions will be up on the Commanders, even in a road game here. So I think Gibbs will bounce back, be a very solid start, and David Montgomery still very startable, although his upside is always capped due to Jahmyr Gibbs. But when it comes to the Commanders running backs, I've been saying the same thing for weeks and weeks now. I'm just staying away. I don't want any of these guys on my roster. I don't want to start any of them. I just don't. There's always a potential for one of these three players, JCM, McNichols, or Rodriguez, to do something. Rodriguez scored this past week, had 12.5 fantasy points. The week before, he had 0.2 fantasy points. Bill hasn't had a double-digit fantasy performance since week 5 of the season. Jeremy McNichols had double digits in week 8. It's just a mess. It's awful for fantasy, and you got to imagine overall the Commanders' offense is going to take a dip with no Jaden Daniels. I think Terry McLaurin is going to continue to nurse that quad injury. This is a tough spot against a good Lions run defense. Even if the Lions had some struggles this past week, you can't feel good really about any of the Washington Commanders offense, and I'm staying far, far away from these Washington Commanders running backs here in week 10. All right, final game of the afternoon window will be the Rams traveling to face the Niners. Let's start with the Rams side of things. Kyren Williams, always a start for me, had 114 rushing yards in week 9 against the Saints, a rushing touchdown, 17.4 fantasy points. You just roll with them every single week. You take what you get. He's given you double digits in every game this year except for one. He has scored 6 rushing touchdowns through 8 games on the season. You got to feel good about Kyren Williams overall. It's been really, really solid. He is a top 12 running back in full and half PPR. And yeah, the Niners are a bit banged up. They're not great against the run, but they're not awful at the same time. Got a great defensive coordinator, but yeah, got to feel good if you own Kyren Williams. Just keep rolling with him. The floor is very, very safe. And Christian McCaffrey, we start every single week. Told you guys last week, don't worry about what happened in week 8. It was a tough matchup. Doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Doesn't matter who's healthy or not healthy. Christian McCaffrey, if you own him, you start him every single week. Had 2 touchdowns this past week, 1 rushing, 1 receiving, 67 receiving yards, 106 yards on the ground, 34.3 fantasy points. He has had 34 more fantasy points in 2 of the last 3 matchups. Outside of week 8 on the season, he has given you 22.7 or more fantasy points in every game. So not a lot to discuss here. I will say it's a tough matchup. The Rams have given up the fewest fantasy points to running backs on the year, and somehow they've given up 0 rushing touchdowns on the year and just 1 receiving touchdown to running backs. So this is a stingy run unit. It's still Christian McCaffrey. He doesn't even need to score to have a good fantasy day, so keep rolling with them. This one's pretty straightforward. We're starting both of our studs in this Week 10 matchup. All right, Sunday Night Football. We're going to have the Steelers traveling to face the Chargers. Let's start with the Steelers side of things. I've encouraged you guys to just keep rolling with Jaylen Warren. Take what you get. It's been a little bit up and down, but he came through for you guys this past week against the Colts with 2 rushing touchdowns, 16.9 fantasy points, and gets a Chargers unit this week who's kind of middle of the pack against opposing running backs. They've actually been better against opposing wide receivers this year than they have against running backs, which is basically the opposite of what they were last year, but still, you got to feel pretty good here. Jaylen Warren's been solid. The ceiling's not always super high, but he can always produce, get some receiving work. So I just keep rolling with Jaylen Warren. There's really nobody else in terms of running backs here for the Steelers that interests me. The only one that I would trust is Jaylen Warren. Now, Kamani Vidal really disappointed this past week, and ultimately, I feel like the Chargers kind of disappointed as a whole, but yeah, it was a great spot against the Tennessee Titans. I was expecting a big week out of Kamani Vidal. A whopping 3 fantasy points this past week. Really disappointing. He still saw 72% of total snaps at the running back position, so still got to feel good. Jarrett Patterson got most of the other snaps as he has had for the past 2 weeks, but it is still primarily Vidal's backfield and gets the Steelers defense that's been a bit wishy-washy against the running back position, but right now they're coming in top 8 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, just 3 rushing touchdowns, 1 rushing touchdown allowed to the running back position. So not a great spot here at the end of the day, but Vidal is certainly still startable. Then Hassan Haskins is on the screen. Sorry, he's on IR. You guys should be looking at Patterson's name. But yeah, the only running back I would have any interest in starting this week for the Chargers would be Kamani Vidal. And I mean, maybe he bounces back this week. We look at the pattern, 22.8, 7.5, 19.7, 3. He's due for double digits. That's what the pattern has been in terms of fantasy points scored. But yeah, the ceiling's not super high here, but Vidal is certainly startable here in week 10 of the season. All right, let's wrap it up with Monday Night Football. We're going to have the Eagles traveling to face the Packers, and what should be a pretty good matchup. Let's start with Saquon Barkley, who's dealing with that groin injury that he suffered in week 8. Was on bye week this past week, so that's probably good for Saquon Barkley owners. Got that extra time to rest and prepare. And a lot of the early reporting has been like this is not a serious injury. So as long as he plays, I'm going to fire up Saquon Barkley against any team, any matchup. Tough matchup against the Packers, but they also just allowed a huge day to Rico Dowdle. So if I own Barkley, I'm rolling with him. But if he's out, I think Tank Bigsby is flexible, was really solid in week 8 in relief of Barkley. 9 touches, 104 rushing yards, 11.5 yards per carry, 10 fantasy points. So I don't want to call him more than a flex. Maybe like we even see another running back used here, like, I don't know, A.J. Dillon, but he's been like a healthy scratch as of late. Maybe Will Shipley. I'm not quite sure, but it looks like Tank Bigsby would get a majority of the snaps. So Barkley, a start if he plays. If not, Bigsby, don't go out of your way to start him, but he is startable, a flex option for you guys here in week 10. We'll just have to leave it at that. Then Josh Jacobs, we start every single week. Doesn't matter who he's playing. He's had a rushing touchdown in every game this year, except for week 3 against the Browns, one of the best run units in the NFL. He's had 12.4 more fantasy points in every game this year. Top 5 running back in half in full PPR. Been as solid as they come, and some people still look at this Eagles unit and they get scared. They are a bottom 10 unit in terms of fantasy points allowed to the running back position, so it's still a good enough matchup at home this week against the Eagles. Don't overthink it. Josh Jacobs, a must-start running back here in week 10. And there you guys have it. Every single running back, every single matchup, who you should be starting, who you should be sitting here in week 10 of the fantasy season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering as many fantasy football questions as I can in the comment section down below. So drop your fantasy questions. I'll get back to as many of you guys as I can throughout the week. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor. Helps out the channel tremendously if you guys hit that subscribe button and that like button on the way out. When the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, don't forget, we're going to have everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So go check out all the content as it drops throughout the week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.